Hey guys, Louis here, and today's interview is with Dr. Eleanor Dickey, and we talked about a bunch of things, but it all revolves around language learning in antiquity. And you'll be surprised to know that actually ancient people had very effective language learning methods, and we have good evidence that using these methods, they actually got to pretty high levels or even up to native speaker levels. So if you're interested in language learning, definitely some inspiration here in the center view and, some concrete methods that you can actually use in your own learning. Dr. Dickey is also a very proficient in German and French, so she had to learn these languages, so we're going to talk about that as well. As always, I'm going to put all of the takeaways from this interview in on my website, so link to that in the description, and let's go to the interview.
So I'm Eleanor Dickey, and most of the time I'm professor of classics at the University of Reading in the UK. This year, I am actually a visiting professor at Ludwig Maximilians Universität in Munich in Germany. So I'm having a total blast teaching in German because I love foreign languages. And before coming to Reading, I taught in the UK at Exeter University, and before that I taught in the US at Columbia University, and before that I taught in Canada at the Université d'Ottawa, where I got to teach in French.
Wow, okay, that's pretty impressive. I was unaware of the teaching part, like in German and French, so I think it's fair to say that your research involves language learning, but you're deep into like the actual language learning yourself, because teaching courses in German and in French, that's pretty hard, I would assume.
It is hard. And possibly I don't do as good a job as somebody would who had spoken those languages since birth, but I think I have more fun than that person would.
For sure, yeah. I'm curious because I would assume that for an English speaker such as yourself, teaching courses in French is probably hard, but I would say probably less hard than German. What do you think
Yeah.
about this?
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah, okay.
I started French in 7th grade in the US. So by the time I went to Canada, I had really quite a lot of studying of French, and I'd spent some time in France. German is a bit harder, but of course I am now older and I've had more time to learn my German. But I just like languages.
Good, yeah, and I want to talk a little bit more about this later. But first of all, I just want to talk a little bit about what it is that the content of your work. My understanding is that you studied how people learn specifically Latin and Greek in antiquity, and
That's right. That's right. So my research focuses on language learning in the ancient world. And that means both Latin speakers learning Greek and Greek speakers learning Latin. Of course, those were not the only people who learned languages in the ancient world, and those were not the only languages that people learned. But that's what we have evidence for, and particularly we have evidence for Greek speakers learning Latin. And this is sort of an accident of preservation. It has to do with the evidence mostly being on papyrus, which is kind of an ancient equivalent of paper. And paper doesn't last very well. If you write something on a paper in most parts of the world and you throw it away, you leave it on the ground, it's not there 2,000 years later. But in Egypt, you have a desert. It's really, really dry. So if you throw out a piece of papyrus in the right place, it is still there 2,000 years later. And in Egypt, what we mainly have is Greek speakers. And when they're learning a language, it's often Latin. So that's why my best evidence is Greek speakers learning Latin. It doesn't mean that that's the only language learning that happened in the ancient world. It just means that that's what I know about.
Right. I'm just curious as far as like why these people learned these languages, because my understanding is that for people to learn Greek was somewhat popular, I guess, at least among, educated people, because I'm not really sure. I mean, there's a lot of knowledge that was just transferred using Greek, but then learning Latin, I'm not really sure. Could you explain what the motivations were?
So you're right that people learn Greek because there's a lot of really classy Greek literature that people want to read. And there's enough of that that it becomes attached to people's social status. So if you want to be a proper educated Roman aristocrat, you need to know Greek. It's not like that with Greek speakers learning Latin. You can be a completely educated Greek speaker and not know a word of Latin. But there are certain purposes for which you might want to know Latin. So, for example, if you want to be a lawyer, you need Latin because Roman law is basically entirely written in Latin, if not by the end of the empire, but for most of the empire. If you want to write a will and you're a Roman citizen, you want that will to be valid, it's got to be in Latin. And one of the main things that lawyers do is they draw up wills. So you have all of these Greek speakers who are learning Latin so that they can produce valid wills for Roman citizens. And then you have the whole legal aspect. And then you have the army. So the Roman army brings a lot of Latin. It's not that everything in the army happens in Latin, but if you want to deal with the army, not even if you want to be in it, but just if you're like trying to sell your agricultural produce to the Roman army, it helps if you have some Latin. So I think those are the two main drivers of people sort of sitting down and systematically trying to learn Latin. But no doubt there were also people who, wanted to travel to Rome and thought they wanted to know some Latin when they got there.
Now, at this point, I've made hundreds of videos and dozens of interviews, and I'm sure that you guys are aware of the fact that comprehensible input, that is reading and listening, is paramount for language learning. And so the truth is, when I was getting started and when I was starting to get serious about language learning, learning English, Japanese, Italian, and so on, I did a ton of listening. But looking back, one of my biggest mistakes was actually using content that was too hard for me. That is to say that I was getting a lot of listening, which is good, but a lot of it was incomprehensible. And so here there are really two solutions. Number one, you can try to get content that is easier. And so, stuff made for kids, etc. But, the problem here is that usually it's pretty boring. And the second solution, which I like much more, is you take content that you actually like. Yes, it's incomprehensible, but you find a way to make it comprehensible. And one tool that I use to make content comprehensible is LingoPie. Now, LingoPie is pretty much the Netflix of language learning in the sense that you can learn languages using videos and TV shows that you actually want to watch. And the way that I actually use LingoPie is in two sort of different phases. So when there's a TV show in a foreign language that I want to watch on Netflix or on the LingoPie website, I actually spend some time watching it on LingoPie so that every time that there's a word that I don't know that comes up, then I can just take a look at the subtitles. They also have dual subtitles, and you can actually take a look at the translation of every word and their explanations as well. And so every scene that I watch, I make sure that it becomes comprehensible to me. And after this initial phase is over, I can just do a lot of binge watching and listening to this TV show because I have made it comprehensible for my level. So LingoPie is a tool that I have been recommending for some time now. And if you want to get started learning with LingoPie, then you can click the link in the description where you'll get a 7-day free trial plus a 55% off discount for the annual subscription. So click the link in the description. I'm always wondering because now we have a lot of technology. I make extensive use of AI, ChatGPT to learn languages and, digital flashcards, and it's really great. But what about these people in, ancient times? I mean, what do we know about how they learned languages, and how do we know that they actually use these methods?
Right. Well, I mentioned earlier that we have these pieces of papyrus from Egypt. And so we have fragments of their textbooks, and we have fragments of their exercises from class. Like For example, they had to learn a new alphabet because Greek is not written in the same alphabet as Latin. So something that we don't even think about when we learn Latin, Latin is in our alphabet, right? So we don't really think about the fact that to learn Latin, we don't have to learn a new alphabet. But for the Greeks, they did have to learn a new alphabet. And so we've got these various pieces, not just of papyrus, but also of broken pottery, even sometimes little pieces of rock, where people are practicing writing the Latin alphabet. They're writing out the letters. And what they would have done while writing out the letters is to say the Latin names of the letters aloud. Because obviously, if you're going to try to be able to read Latin, you've got to start with the alphabet. Now, not everybody did read Latin. Some people learned Latin only as a spoken language. And we know that because we've also got tons of papyri, especially from the 1st and 2nd century AD, where the Latin is in Greek transliteration. So they're learning Latin, but they're not learning the alphabet. And that means they don't intend to use it for reading. They just want to speak. So these people are not going to law school. And I think part of what's interesting about those transliterated papyri is that they're doing some quite serious grammar learning. So they're learning lots of verb forms, for example. They're learning lots of vocab, not even just obviously, if you want to have a conversation, there's a lot of vocabulary that you need. But they're learning words that would not be high on my list of the first couple of thousand words to learn, like the names of all the different winds, the names of really obscure kinds of fish, the names of all the stars and planets and the signs of the zodiac. It looks like they're actually reaching quite a high level of grammar and of vocabulary without learning the alphabet, which is interesting. And then, of course, there's also this group that does learn the alphabet. And the next thing they do after the alphabet is they have these really cute little bilingual dialogues. So nowadays, you might have a dialogue where, in a French book, you're going to a cafe in Paris and you're ordering a croissant and you pay for it in euros. And you might need to memorize the dialogue. At least that's what we did in my French class. And the idea is that you can use those phrases if you end up in Paris and you happen to want a croissant and you happen to want to pay for it in euros, and you're really lucky and the waiter uses the phrases that were used in your textbook. So there's dialogues like that. So you go to the baths and you kind of negotiate your way through the Roman baths, or you go shopping and you bargain for a pinula. And those dialogues include a whole bunch of dialogues where somebody's learning Latin, which is just super cool because you have this description of somebody going into his Latin class and saying, "Hello, teacher. From today, I want to work hard. So please teach me to speak Latin." And then you see what the teacher does. So we know a lot about language learning from these descriptions that we get in these bilingual texts.
Guys, I just want to take 20 seconds away from this interview to tell you that my vocabulary decks, the Anki Core decks, which are the most comprehensive vocabulary decks on the internet, are going to go on sales if you use the discount code in the description of this video. There are multiple languages available. They're compatible with Anki. There are about 8,000 to 11,000 flashcards. And you have a lot of information on them. Check out the website in the description, ankicoredex.com, and use the discount code in the description. Only the first 20 people will have this discount available. So back to the interview.
Right. Well, that's fascinating because I always thought of this approach of having stories, little stories adapted for language learners as being a fairly recent invention. I did the Assimil method for Italian and Japanese, and that's sort of similar. And there are lots of websites that sort of do the same thing, but you're saying that they've been using this method for thousands of years, literally. And so they had these little dialogues written, I suppose, by a teacher. And then do we know what they did with these dialogues? They would
Yes.
actually
They'll
memorize them?
memorize. So the dialogue is written in two very narrow columns. So it's one or
Uh-huh.
two words, and they line up. So it's not a word for word translation, it's a line for line translation. And that means that they can get it to really match, because, with an interlinear word for word translation, you're going to run into trouble. One language is not actually going to make any sense. But if you
Uh-huh.
can vary the length of the units that you're translating, and if you compose your text bilingually for that format, you can get something that makes sense and makes grammar in both languages. So you have this bilingual text, and you memorize the half in the language that you're learning. And you use the half in the language that you already know to make sure you understand what you're memorizing. So then once you've memorized it, you go up to the teacher and you recite it. Whether they recite it individually or in pairs, I am not completely sure. My guess is that they do it in pairs because these are dialogues, and so it kind of makes more sense as a dialogue. But that's not actually stated in the text. And reading, of course, is hard in the ancient world because they hadn't invented word division. So for us, when you're learning to read in a foreign language, at least there's spaces between the words. Well, okay, not with every single language, but with most languages, there's spaces between the words. And that means that if you're stuck on a word, then you can identify the particular word you're stuck on and look it up in a dictionary or however you deal with it. You know what the word is you have a problem with. Whereas if you're in the ancient world, you just have this string of letters. And if you can't break it up into words, you're completely helpless. You can't use a dictionary. You don't know where anything begins. So you have to learn a lot of vocab very early on. You can't be turned loose on a normal text
Right.
until you have a lot more vocab than a modern learner really needs in order to do the equivalent. And therefore, these bilingual texts are really good for vocabulary building and for helping with the word division, because there's only a few words per line. They still are not always divided, but it's a lot easier when there's only one or two words per line than when there's like 15.
Yeah. See, yeah, this is it's so cool because I'm using something that is somewhat similar, at least. I'm using an activity. It's called prepared talks, but essentially you have it's not really a conversation necessarily. It's just a speech, a short speech that maybe you generate using ChatGPT. And then I just sort of learn it by heart. And I know there's this whole thing now online with language learning, rote memorization is bad. You have to acquire the language. But I've just found that memorizing things is not only just supported by the current scientific evidence, but it makes for long lasting, just available sentences in your mind. And it's so beneficial. But so from what you said, my understanding is that they would start using these small dialogues, line by line translations. They would memorize them and then recite them. We don't exactly know how, but they would recite them to a teacher. And so this teacher is a native speaker of the
No,
language being learned? No?
no. The teachers are usually not native speakers, at least for Greek speakers learning Latin. Probably when Latin speakers are learning Greek, they have more access to native teachers. But in Egypt, there aren't that many Latin speakers. And the ones that there are often sort of important high-ranking government officials who are not going to be spending their time teaching Latin. So we can tell from the mistakes that people make that a lot of the teachers are not native speakers of Latin. It's not just the mistakes, it's also what they care about. So, for example, the Latin alphabet, it's got 5 vowels, just like our alphabet. But each of those vowels can be pronounced in different ways. It can be either long or short. In Greek, you have 7 vowels. You have 3, the A, the I, and the O can be either long or short. And then there's 2 of them, the A, the I, and the U can be either long or short. And then the E and the O, they have different letters for when it's long and when it's short. So a short E is epsilon and a long E is eta. A short O is omicron and a long O is omega. And so when a Greek speaker is reading out a Latin text, reading it aloud, they ask themselves, is that E an epsilon or is it an eta? Is that O an omicron or is it an omega? And then they mark the long vowels. They mark the long E's and they mark the long O's. But they don't mark the A's or the I's or the U's because the teacher's not really a Latin speaker. The teacher doesn't care about the length of A and I and U. The teacher only cares about the length of E and O because the teacher's still thinking like a Greek speaker.
So then they would recite the little dialogue to the teacher who may not be a native speaker. So that's when you start, and then this sort of phase in the beginning would allow you to build up, some vocabulary, at least a high frequency vocabulary. And then is this method actually used all throughout their learning, or do they just go on to doing other activities?
Yeah, then they go on. So they start out with these bilingual things which were purpose written for learners. And they stay on those until they have enough vocab to go somewhere else. And the next step in the somewhere else is probably a bilingual version of actual Roman literature. So we have bilingual Ciceros and bilingual Virgils. And so they do those just like the bilingual beginners dialogues, except they're harder because now they're not written to fit the bilingual format. So sometimes the Greek is really, really strange. And then when they've got far enough that they can cope, they go on to reading a monolingual Latin text with a running glossary. So a glossary with words in the order that they appear in the text. And the idea is that they gloss all the words that are hard for a student. And they don't always, I'm sure that it was really hard for some students reading those texts, particularly Virgil with those glosses, but that's the idea. And then the next stage is they read a text without a word list that runs in order. And at that point, they are probably using a dictionary in alphabetical order because we see them writing in the Greek translation above the Latin words. So the Latin is, of course, just a string of letters because there isn't any word division and there isn't usually punctuation or capitalization or anything else helpful like that. And so the Greek-speaking student is kind of preparing this text, and he prepares the text, or she prepares the text. We know that people of both genders are learning languages. So the student prepares the text by looking words up and writing them in between the lines, just like some of my students do, but also something that my students never have to do, putting in the punctuation so that they work out where the punctuation goes, and also marking the long vowels. And I think what that shows is that what they're going to do with that text is they're going to read it aloud in Latin to the teacher with correct pronunciation and correct punctuation, and then they're going to translate it into Greek.
Right. And so at this stage, there's no memorization. It's just reading and translating.
Well, there probably is. It's hard for me to tell what's being used concurrently. So, I have these pieces of papyrus, and I can see what happens on each one. But what I don't know is the student who does this in the morning, what's he doing in the afternoon? And my hunch is that they do go on memorizing for quite a while, and particularly they memorize lists of vocabulary. So they have vocabulary lists that are classified by subject. So like 20 words for animals, 10 words for birds, 50 words for types of human character, this kind of thing. And those are, bilingual in 2 columns, the Latin word and the Greek word. And it looks as though people went on memorizing vocab from those lists for quite a while. That helps them, it helps them when they have to divide up the words in a text, if they recognize words. Another thing that they will have memorized is poetry. So when you're learning Latin, you typically read Virgil, and when you're learning Greek, you typically read Homer. And in both cases, they are probably memorizing chunks of that and then reciting it. Now, of course, those poems they're not exactly in contemporary language. So if you're learning Greek and you've memorized a chunk of Homer, it's not necessarily going to enable you to communicate with your neighbor, but it's going to help with reading more Homer, which is one of the things that you're going to do.
Right. And so I'm not aware, I've never read Virgil, but Homer, I tried reading some of it, and I mean the translation, at least in English, and it, the translation, the contemporary translation is already a bit obscure to me as a French speaker, but I don't know if so I'm assuming that right now, even for a Greek person, reading the original text of Homer would be quite hard. But then back then, 2,000 years ago, was it normal language for people, or was it already
No.
pretty obscure?
So the
Right.
Homeric poems, it's disputed when they date to, but maybe around the 7th century or so BC. So they're pretty early. They're earlier than classical Athens is the 5th century BC. That's sort of Plato and Thucydides and Herodotus and people like that. Some of those are even the 4th century. So Homer is already a couple of 100 years old at that point. And people are already having some trouble with the language. The brutal truth is that Homer didn't write in normal language even of his own time. I mean, Homer probably didn't write anyway, but he wasn't composing his poems in ordinary colloquial Greek, even of his own time. It was always, kind of strange, beautiful, poetic language. And by the time of the papyri that I'm seeing in Egypt, we're in kind of the 2nd, 3rd, 4th century AD. This is getting on for 1,000 years old. So, it's hard. Picture reading Beowulf today, or for you, if you're a French speaker, the Chanson de Roland. I mean, that's not easy. And similarly, Homer was not easy for a Greek-speaking child. We know that because, of course, we've got way more papyri of Greek-speaking children struggling with Homer than we do of people learning Latin.
In terms of logistics, because I'm trying to imagine, so first of all, the people learning languages, were they mostly adults or kids?
That depends on where you are. So the Latin speakers learning Greek are kids. The Greek speakers learning Latin are mostly adults.
Okay. They're adults because for the most part, they're learning Latin for work, or I mean, not necessarily work, but for legal reasons and to function in society.
Yeah. Latin is something, so Greek is something that you learn at primary school as part of your basic education if you're a Roman. If you're a Greek speaker, Latin is something that you learn as part of your sort of final professional training. If you are going to law school or dealing with the army or whatever. So that's why they're older.
And I'm going to guess also that the Latin-speaking kids learning Greek, they're probably not average kids. They're probably, in wealthy families for the most part.
Yeah, it's complicated because what does average mean? I mean, poor children are not going to school at all. School is not free. So there's a substantial percentage of the population, and I cannot quantify it any better than substantial. A lot of work has been done on that, and we just don't know, who never go to school. They never learn to read and write at all. This is okay in the ancient world. We live in this hyper-literate society where you basically, you're an outcast of society if you can't read and write. You're cut off from practically everything. That's just not true in the ancient world. It's fine. There's no problem with it. There's a scribe in every village who will read stuff to you if you need it, write things for you. I mean, you're going to have to pay him, but you don't have to pay him very much. So it's not that important to learn to read and write. And therefore, it's not maybe something that, maybe to say a normal person, maybe the definition of normal would include not going to school. People who do go to school in Rome, I think the vast majority of those are learning Greek.
And so let's take the example of Greek-speaking people learning Latin, who are mostly adults, apparently, because I think the listeners would probably identify, they're mostly adults. So these adults would, what would happen then? They would go in a classroom with multiple students and there is one teacher?
Probably not. Now, this is something that's really challenging. But my belief is that for most of antiquity, instruction is probably in ones and twos because there aren't big classes of people wanting to learn Latin. At the very late period, like the 5th century onwards, you might start getting actual Latin classes, but inside a law school. And outside of law schools, it's still going to be ones and twos, just because the demand is not there that would make a real class meaningful.
Right. And so you're getting, for the most part, almost private lessons, but this would seem just overly expensive. I don't know. Is this expensive, you think?
It's hard to know. Teachers are, on the whole, not that well paid. So it may not be that expensive. If you keep in mind that, somebody who wants to go to law school is probably not from a really poor background.
Mm-hmm.
It probably is not that expensive, but it's hard to quantify.
I guess some things don't really change, right? Teachers not being very well paid, but so they get these private lessons. And in terms of like the papyrus, I'm wondering, because obviously they couldn't, there was no printer, so you would get a papyrus, but then it's a private lesson, so the teacher would give it to you, and there's only one papyrus for the text, and then the teacher would reuse the same papyrus for multiple students?
Very often, step one is the student makes a copy of the papyrus. Because if the teacher's got one copy of it, the teacher doesn't necessarily want, with a dialogue, it's not really that practical to have only one copy because you both have to look at it. And more generally, you don't necessarily, papyrus is really fragile. There's not like modern books. You don't necessarily want the student constantly rolling and unrolling your papyrus roll because it's not going to last very long. So somebody needs to copy that roll. And a rich student can, of course, pay somebody to copy the roll, or even, pay. There are booksellers who have pre-made copies of things. So you can buy a copy of the book, or you can pay a scribe to make a copy of a particular book. But you do lose something if you do that, because the process of writing it out yourself obviously helps you understand the contents. So often it's probably the student who is making the copy.
Okay, and so these roles that you're talking about, you were able to study them because do you actually have them physically at the university, or are they kept in some other location?
So they're mostly not intact. We have fragments primarily. Um, and they're kept all over the world, like any other results of archaeological excavations. They're kind of scattered. So they're I've traveled around looking at the ones that are in Europe, and they're in libraries here and museums there, and all the fragments are pretty small. We also have some medieval copies of these bilingual textbooks. So some things we only have on papyrus, but some things are also useful in the Middle Ages. And those are things that could also be used for learning Greek, because in the medieval Greek world, people are not learning Latin. So we don't have any Eastern manuscripts of language learning texts. We only have the papyri. But we do have Western manuscripts. So we have things that were copied in medieval Europe by Latin speakers who wanted to learn Greek. And everybody knows that in the medieval West, they didn't learn Greek until the Renaissance. That's what the Renaissance is all about, right? It's when they all start learning Greek again. But that doesn't mean they didn't try. So we got all these manuscripts of people trying really hard to learn Greek. And these are great because they're intact. So the papyri are these small fragments, but the manuscripts give us the whole text. And when you have a manuscript and a papyrus of a particular text, then you know how it's been changed in between. Even if the papyrus fragment is only very small, it still tells you
Right.
that that text existed in, say, the 4th century in Egypt and what it looked like. And then the manuscript tells you what it said.
Right. And I feel like there's a lot of, so as we said, the roles contain dialogues or texts that you memorize, the text, and you annotate, and you try to speak them out loud, and you translate them. Is there any sense of maybe some sort of grammar instruction back then? I
Yes.
mean, yeah.
Yes. So they have, just the way we do, really, they have sort of two kinds of grammar learning. One is learning of paradigms, learning of like verb forms, noun forms, because both Latin and Greek, they've got a lot of forms. And so they then have these long and really not very coherent explanations of what the ablative case is and how you use it. And it's really interesting to see them struggling with trying to explain that. It was the Greeks who invented grammar, so pretty much all of our grammatical terminology goes back to them in one way or another. And the Romans kind of borrowed it from them. That's why the Latin names for most things are just translations of the Greek names. But there was a lot that they hadn't fully managed to understand, like the ablative case. And so sometimes their explanations are really, you can't understand how anybody ever managed to understand anything from those. But sometimes the explanations are quite good.
I want to ask you questions more about your own language learning, because you have taught classes in English, obviously, but then this is your native language, but then in French and in German. I suppose these languages are not too far off from English, but still they're pretty hard. I'm thinking specifically of German. So how would you evaluate your level in French and German? I suppose if you're teaching classes, it must be pretty advanced.
Yeah. I've not ever taken any of the standardized tests in either language, so I think pretty advanced is all I can really say. I can't give you a code for it. Yeah, I started learning German in high school.
Mhm.
And yeah, I'm now over 50. So I've had a lot of a lot of time to learn German. And I'd thought it was kind of boring sitting in classes learning languages, especially as, I did that with Latin and Greek. That was my main subject. I didn't really want to do it with German as well. So I spent a summer on a farm in Germany. And I really recommend farm work as an awesome way to learn languages, because farmers tend to be pretty monolingual. They might know some English, but they're not going to know enough English that they really want to speak it to you. Plus, I find farm work really interesting. So I'd spend this summer learning how to cut hay with a scythe and milk a cow by hand and things like that, and doing it all in German. And it didn't give me the vocabulary that I really needed for my academic work, but it did give me a kind of overall grasp of how the language works and a certain amount of fluency. And once you've got that, I mean, of course, I did have several years of having studied it before I went and did that, and that was crucial. But once you have that level of fluency, then the vocabulary is much easier to pick up. And, as a classicist, you read German all the time. I had to prove that I knew both French and German in order to get my degrees, because you can't be a classicist if you can't read the literature in German. So, I learned it as a student. And the reason I went to that farm was because wanting to do a PhD, I needed to have good German. But I've kept it up because I'm always reading German because I'm a classicist and I like the language. So I speak it when I can.
So to get your degree, you had to learn French and German, but also Latin and Greek, right?
That's right. That's right. So I went to Bryn Mawr College in the U.S., but I don't think Bryn Mawr is unusual that way. And in order to get a master's in classics, you had to prove that you had Latin and Greek and French and German.
Well, that sounds like a lot of work. I mean, 4 languages. I think most people are struggling just enough with one language, but 4 languages and 2 ancient languages, that's a lot of work. Do you have an idea of what really worked best? What would you recommend that other people do based on your own experience?
I'd recommend that people do something really fun in the language they're learning. So something I like to do in German, for example, is read German children's books. And now I read pretty tough German children's books. There was a time when I was reading comics because that was what was fun, that was at my level. And so if you find something that you really want to read, that's fun to read, and that is at a level that's appropriate for you. So, if you don't know very much German, maybe, it will be Asterix, which is where I was long ago. And then you kind of work up, because comics are a good way to understand what the story is and pick up the vocab quickly. And then literature is just fun. If you find something that you want to do, that you want to read, it keeps you going. Because what's dangerous with language learning is if you don't do it because you don't find it fun. So you need to do something that is fun so that you'll keep doing it.
Right. I do have one last question that I forgot to ask about language learning in the ancient times. Do we have any sense of how good people were able to get eventually using their methods?
We do, yes, because we have some texts that were written in Latin by people who we can tell are not native speakers of Latin. So when somebody becomes absolutely perfect, so that he sounds just like a native speaker or she sounds just like a native speaker, then we can't tell anymore, right? Because we don't know who these people
Right.
were. But when they're almost to the level of a native speaker, then we know that this was a learner who was able to get almost to the level of a native speaker. And we do have those. And that causes me to be pretty sure that some people probably got further than that and were indistinguishable from native speakers. So yeah, it worked. They could learn to a very high level.
Wow, that's pretty impressive. All right, so Eleanor, thank you so much. This was very insightful. I'm sure a lot of people are getting inspired to maybe go into start using ancient methods for learning languages. I'm going to put all the takeaways from this interview in the description box on YouTube and on my website as well. So, Eleanor, thank you so much.
Thank you.